I thought the presentations we just got were great at really getting at the meat of the practices that can be used and how those get adapted to different systems. And so what I want to do in this session is to kind of put a little bit of a framework around that, talk a bit more about the principles and which practices go with each of those principles, and then transition to talk about some of the barriers to adoption that we're also going to spend a lot more time on today, because you have some great presentations in store from Michelle and team on the economics of soil health. So with that, I'm going to bring up this example. This is a Midwest example. It fits for Missouri and maybe a little bit further west from there. Most of you are not in corn soybean kinds of situations, but this example is just such a great one of how the soil health principles work and how you can see them working in the field. Right here, you're looking at an aerial imagery of a cornfield, and you see this funny dark line that goes through. Well, turned out what that line was an old fence row, and you can see the effects of that old fence row, which used to be a hedgerow, right? So if you think about the 4 principles of soil health, right? Minimize disturbance. And a fence row, there is basically no disturbance. Everything is just kind of growing. It hardly even gets mowed. Lots of stuff is just diverse, right? And it's not getting disturbed. Maximize soil cover, right? There's living plants there. Any leaves that fall in that hedgerow go on the ground. Any grasses that die there, they stay there. So you've got really maximized soil cover. You've got minimized soil disturbance. So you're protecting the home of those microbes, right? And then there's the other 2 principles that are about feeding the microbes. You've got maximizing biodiversity and maximizing living roots. And again, if you think about a fence row, right, biodiversity is about as high as you get in the agricultural agroecosystems kind of space, because you've got lots of different plants in that hedgerow. You've got a lot of wildlife often using those hedgerows as corridors of movement. And so there's lots of diversity, and of course there's lots of living roots, because all those plants are there year round. Now, that hedgerow isn't an agriculturally productive system in the way that we would think about it, but it often harbors a lot of the predators for a lot of our pests, for example. So those hedgerows are actually economically useful for a lot of systems. Now, take a hedgerow like that out, and for several years in, farmers know this. They know that as they're driving across an old hedgerow, if they've got a yield monitor, they will notice the yields jump, and sometimes jump drastically because of that. Now, the cool thing about the soil health principles is basically the concept is that we're mimicking nature, right? A hedgerow is pretty much the natural state for that system. And when you mimic nature, when you take those principles and you put them to work in a crop field, what you do is basically expand that effect, that hedgerow effect, that natural ecosystem effect, and you expand it across an entire field. And so here what you see is side by side a conventional cornfield and a soil health management system kind of cornfield, where all those systems are in place, all those principles are in place. And you can see the dramatic difference here. This was in a year where there was a fair bit of rain. And so on the right in that system, you can see that the crop didn't do as well. You can see in all those various depressions where things got too wet and the crop couldn't really grow, and nitrogen turned into nitrous oxide and N2, and so basically didn't work. Whereas on the left side of that, you've got your soil health system that is much more resilient and was able to deal with those extremes. So that's just one more example, right? Marilyn showed you a number of examples. We've been looking at these kinds of examples, and this is a really good one of that side to side, how we can create the kind of effect that is there in natural ecosystems to take advantage of that in our agriculture, and therefore have a much more ecological agriculture. So I'm just going to bring back these principles briefly. You've been hearing about them. I hope that they stick with you, because I think if you know not much else about soil health or the exact practices, being able to talk to somebody about, there's basically just 4 things to remember, and here's what they are, and here's why they matter. We're protecting the habitat, we're feeding those organisms, and those organisms work for us, right? Those organisms are what make a farmer money when we're taking care of them. So a system then, a soil health management system, is bringing practices together to really apply to a particular production system in the context of that producer. And like Caitlin was saying earlier, right? we might have to work with a producer and just start with something small, because a little bit is better than nothing. And they might never transition to a full soil health management system, or it might take them 10 years, and that's okay. We meet every producer where they're at. You know, Marlon said he doesn't really waste his time with the folks that are just naysayers, because there's so much demand, right? And we're seeing this. There's more and more demand of producers really excited about the possibility of transitioning to these systems and really having a thirst for that knowledge of how to make that happen. And so I think a lot of the time, the barriers these days are getting enough technical assistance to those producers who are raring and ready to go and wanting to make those transitions right away. So we'll work with the ones as they come. You know, we'll continue to keep inspiring people, but we need to remember that these systems have to be adapted for the production system. And so I'm going to talk a bit about which practices we use. So if we're talking about protecting below ground livestock, right? Minimizing disturbance, maximizing cover, which practices can we use for that? So the types of disturbance that we're talking about when we're talking about minimizing disturbance are physical, chemical, and biological disturbance, and basically human disturbance, right? I've sometimes heard folks talk about rangeland and saying, well, why do you talk about minimizing disturbance? Sometimes rangeland is best when it is disturbed, right? Fires will move through and regenerate that rangeland. And I would say, yeah, you can always find a way to say, oh, this doesn't work. But the way that I would talk about the 4 principles there is in a rangeland system that naturally has fire as part of the ecosystem, the disturbance would be suppressing that fire. So we're looking to mimic what nature has adapted in that climate, those soil types for those systems, and to do as much of that as is feasible in our agricultural production that we use to produce our food and everything else, right? We're looking to not have to fight nature. So physical disturbance, tillage, grazing compaction, heavy equipment traffic, chemical disturbances, if we're not appropriately adapting fertilizer, pesticides, soil amendments, those become chemical disturbances. Biological disturbances, grazing, when it is overgrazing, can certainly become a biological disturbance. Fallow systems where there's just nothing growing at all, monoculture communities. So those are some of the disturbances we're talking about. And so why minimize the disturbance is basically when there is disturbance, we decrease the quality of the habitat for those organisms. And so we need to allow for that lack of disturbance to help us build the soil structure and all the associated functions. Also, minimizing disturbance often means that we have vastly naturally improved pest resistance, and we have much better nutrient interactions. So we get better crops and we get better environmental outcomes. So what practices are we talking about when we're talking about minimizing disturbance? I'm going to give you the NRCS practice codes, because any of you who may connect your farmers to some of the resources out there, I think one of the best resources certainly is NRCS, because there's at the county level the system that provides some technical assistance and also the financial assistance for anybody who qualifies when they go through the ranking process for that state. So residue and tillage management is the NRCS speak for no-till or reduced tillage. And here are the practice codes. That's a way to reduce physical disturbance. Conservation cover, basically covering soils that are in rough shape or that are fairly sensitive, that may not be making a lot of money. You can actually get a payment and technical assistance to put in place appropriately adapted conservation cover. Nutrient management, not putting on too much, putting on just enough for the crop, and how you adapt that to your system. Integrated pest management, prescribed grazing, right? So all of these practices are ways to minimize disturbance. And basically that means that we go for tillage, for example, from a space where if you till up your soil, you get lots of microbial activity from all of that organic matter being chewed up really fast as you get a bunch of air in there, and a whole bunch of those organisms are no longer where they need to be. There's a lot of respiration and then it drops off, whereas in a no-till or reduced till system, you have that respiration as a sign of life in the soil that is a lot more consistent over the course of the year. So then maximizing soil cover, right? If you think about dust storms out west, those dust storms can't happen when the wind crosses covered fields. And that's why Marlon was really pushing on that one. He said, yeah, that's a really key important soil health principle. If we can just maximize soil cover, if there was only one you remembered and across the entire earth, we maximize soil cover, right? A lot of the others kind of come along with that, because if you have maximized cover, you can't disturb as well. If you have maximized cover, you're going to have living roots more, and you're going to have more biodiversity, just because otherwise you can't really keep the soil covered. So maximize soil cover is really critical, and we wouldn't have these kinds of dust storms. We wouldn't have the kinds of erosion events and the kind of flooding that we often see if all of our soils were just covered. So, here's all the benefits of maximizing soil cover: decreasing erosion, increasing infiltration, decreasing evaporation, moderating soil temperatures, moderating the habitat for soil organisms, increasing food available to biota, mitigating compaction from machines and livestock, right? So there's just a whole lot of really great benefits of maximizing soil cover. And again, what practices? What practices can you use? Cover cropping is a really big one. We are still lagging behind in cover crop adoption. We're pretty much in the single-digit percentages of adoption for cover crops. And I would say that in most of the country, there are opportunities for cover cropping. Just in some of the systems, it's still tricky. We're still needing to figure out which species, how do we plant them, at what rate do we plant, how do we get them growing, at what time of year, how do we integrate them into the system, how do we terminate them so we can get the next crop growing. There are those questions there, but cover crop is a really excellent opportunity for all of these various benefits that we've been talking about. Again, reducing tillage is a really big one for maintaining soil cover, because you're not tilling under all of that residue, so it can be there to protect the soil surface. Conservation cover, mulching, controlled traffic, forage and biomass planting, and prescribed grazing. So these practices all do their part to covering the soil. And so depending on your system, maybe a cover crop doesn't work for you, but you can apply a mulch, right? A lot of small vegetable farms, especially in climates where you really can grow cash crops year round, they may not have the opportunity to cover crop, but they may have the opportunity to cover the rest of the soil with some kind of a mulch layer. And of course, a crop, whether it's a crop or a cover crop, while it's growing, that's really nice soil cover. You just need to be sure that you have enough growing there that it is actually covering the soil. But often when plants are spaced out a fair bit, you want something else on the ground, and so it's great to have some kind of a mulch still covering that soil. Controlled traffic can be great, because again, you can prevent all of that residue from being turned under and keep it as a nice protective layer across the top. And then the more grazing practices, right? Making sure that the forage, the biomass that is growing is actually really productive. So NRCS will help out with planting new, better adapted forages and biomass to enable that, and prescribed grazing. Really doing good rotational grazing will do a lot to keep soil cover in place. The other set of principles: how do we feed our below ground livestock? And of course, feed versus protect, right? A lot of these principles are a little interactive, and you get a little of both in both, but to just kind of put a framework around it, I think maximizing living roots and maximizing diversity, those are really more about feeding the underground life, whereas the other two are more about protecting. But obviously there's, you can only put things in boxes so much. So how do we feed our below ground life? One really critical thing, we've talked about that multiple times, multiple speakers have referred to this: we need to keep living roots in the soil for as much of the year as possible, because that's really how carbon gets into the ground. Now we can add manure, we can add compost, we can add other biomass to make up for the lack of living roots. But in terms of really getting fresh, delicious material that those microbes love right there, delivered to them fresh from the root, right? There's something to that. We really want to maximize those living roots. And they, of course, do a lot of other really great things for the soil, aggregating the soils, putting new pores, making those pores more continuous than they were before, etc. So how do we maximize living roots? Well, We need to grow crops and cover crops in the off season. So we need to find cover crops that fit in the windows where otherwise there's no crop. As Marlon was talking about the one producer, I had to smile where he said that, you know, this guy fallows for about 30 minutes, right? That's ideal. That's what we're looking for. Now, can every producer do that? Probably not. There are always challenges, whether they're challenges of timing, whether they're challenges of adaptation of a particular cover crop, or even access to cover crop seed can be an issue. But ideally, if we can get to a situation where we grow our cover crop and as we're harvesting it, we plant the cover crop, or even before we harvest the crop, we can interseed the cover crop in between the crop and then harvest our crop so that the cover crop is already established. So we go from living roots of the main crop waning to living roots of the cover crop getting really well established before the main crop is harvested. We want to avoid bare fallow. I know there are definitely reasons for bare fallow. It can be hard to get away with when you have insidious weed pressure like on some organic farms, but wherever possible, if we can avoid bare fallow, that's certainly better for soil health. We want to increase time in perennial crops. So whoever has a production system that can take advantage of some perennial crops, this is one reason to integrate livestock where that is feasible. Perennial crops are really pretty ideal for soil health because they're your living roots year round, right? And we need to manage our rotations and intercrop mixtures and forage height to adequately address that. And again, what practices, again, grouped by NRCS practices with their code: conservation crop rotation, conservation cover crop, forage and biomass planting, prescribed grazing, and soil carbon amendment. We haven't talked a lot about that, but right now American Farmland Trust is doing a lot of work with biochar, which is one of the soil carbon amendments, because there are huge opportunities to integrate some very stable organic matter, stable for hundreds to thousands of years, in soils by adding biochar, which is low oxygen charred organic matter that gets added to the soil. And why am I adding that under presence of living roots? Well, basically there's a whole lot of literature right now that shows that plants grow better when biochar is applied in ways that are just right, adapted to that system to improve those soils for better growth. Compost similarly can really improve plant growth and improve resiliency, and so can increase the ability for living roots to be proliferating throughout the year. Maximizing biodiversity. How do we do that? What practices? We really want to maximize diversity in our systems, right? We have a lot of systems in our conventional agriculture today that are very monoculture based. And we know that that's not sustainable. And we know, looking out to the future with climate change that's coming, with increases in population, with the kinds of extremes that are happening, it's only a matter of time before a new pest comes through that may actually wipe out large amounts of our corn crop or our soybean crop, right? It's something that scientists are grappling with, that agronomists are grappling with, how to keep up with the pests that are coming through. And so the more diverse our food supply, the more resilient it's going to be. And from a soil health standpoint, microbes want a diverse diet. And so really providing them not just with corn, for instance, but having multiple different crops in rotation, or even having intercrops, like Marlon was talking about earlier, that's really the ideal for soil health. And again, there's a lot to be figured out about exactly how to do that. But there are some ways that we can do that. If we grow diverse cover crops that have grasses, legumes, various different forbs, brassicas, you name it, when we have those diverse mixtures, that certainly creates a lot of diversity in that rotation. We can increase the diversity of crop rotations, especially where there are markets available. We can integrate livestock where that is feasible. We can bring them in to graze cover crops. AFT is doing some work in the mid-Atlantic where we are pairing crop producers and livestock producers, where a crop producer may not want to own their own livestock, but they're okay with a livestock producer coming in and grazing their cover crop, and that inspires them to actually grow the cover crop because they can then rent the rights to grazing that to a livestock producer. So there are a lot of options that can be explored for really increasing that biodiversity. And again, you see a lot of the same practices, right? Conservation crop rotation, conservation cover crop, forage and biomass planting, integrated pest management, prescribed grazing, and soil carbon amendment. All of those will increase biodiversity, both above ground in plants and animals, and below ground in the kinds of microbes that are able to proliferate and really do well in that system. Few notes about cover crops in water limited environments. We've addressed this a little bit, and I just want to highlight that again. There are challenges to growing cover crops when you're water limited. There are ways to overcome some of those challenges. Some of them are figured out. Some of them we're in the middle of figuring them out, and I bet there's a lot of ingenuity yet to come up with. Cover crops do improve water infiltration and soil water holding capacity, while they are also reducing soil erosion, even in these dry systems. Even if you just get a little bit of something growing, that can be better. But there are some studies out there that show that when you grow cover crops, while they improve soil health, they do use up enough moisture that sometimes they can decrease yields. So that's something to be aware of. Now, decreased yield may not be a terrible thing if you have something else economically that you can take advantage of. And so, for example, in those water limited situations where farmers are growing cover crops, one of the best ways to make that economical is grazing, because at that point you have a new product that can be sold that is highly valuable. And if livestock can actually take advantage of that cover crop, you know, you're covering the ground, you've got living roots, you're also adding manure that also helps with soil health, and then you've got an additional thing to sell that wasn't there before, and that can actually make up for the reduced cash crop yield. So the bottom line is that cover crops do improve soil health in water limited environments, but that it is still a little bit tricky to figure out where and how they can be economically most beneficial. But it is certainly really important for us to keep trying and to keep innovating along this space, and to help producers have access to ways to do that in a low risk kind of way. And we're going to talk a lot more about farmers and their management practices on Thursday and in the water scarcity panel on Friday. So I think that there'll be more on this topic. So lots of options, right? You don't see this on every farm, but from cover crops being rolled down to cover crops being interseeded into corn grown with this kind of high clearance interseeder, cover crops such as this tillage radish here that go really deep and put really nice big holes. I've actually heard of farmers transplanting onions into the holes left behind by a frozen tillage radish. Triticale and winter pea kind of cover crop mix, right? It makes really nice forage. A lot of rotational grazing. The impacts of biochar well used in wheat in Spokane, Washington. You can see that difference right here, pretty amazing. Zone tillage equipment, right? So here are some beautiful pictures. There's a lot more of them out there. If you have pictures to share with us of your innovative producers that you know in your area, we would love it, because I think a picture is 1,000 words, and it's always great to really touch base with that side and share that with people, because it's a great way to reach people. Couple of words about pasture management, right? Grazing can be good for soil health, grazing can be bad for soil health, and it all depends on how it's managed. So continuous grazing, right, overgrazing, leads to uneven fertility, leads to poor productivity, because those grasses just can't grow anymore if they're continuously being grazed off as soon as they start to grow. Weeds can take over that are unpalatable to livestock. We get really poor structure in the soils, compaction, erosion issues, right? But when we graze well, we actually get really good results. And so you can see here side by side in South Dakota, on the left an overgrazed pasture, and on the right a rotationally grazed pasture, and you can really see that difference in the status of the grasses. And here again, you know, on the left you have an overgrazed pasture, on the right you have a rotationally grazed pasture. And when you have really good pasture management, that appropriate grazing frequency and intensity really starts to build soil health, because when you allow your plants to fully regrow, that's a lot more living roots, and that's a lot more organic matter, a lot more diversity that's allowed to happen there. And so you're getting good aeration, good aggregation, therefore good infiltration, lower compaction, temperature and moisture are better balanced in a well-grazed system that's able to grow really well in between those rotations. And beef production is usually higher, and those soil health systems really proliferate, and folks start to see a lot better gains on their livestock. So there's some practices, right? And we've seen the spiral before. I'm not going to go through it again, but I wanted to put it up again because this is really what it's about, right? We're trying to turn that degradation spiral around. We're trying to flip it upside down and use those soil health principles to regenerate those soil function in all of our various systems. So just a brief check-in with everybody. True or false? The soil health management principles of minimizing disturbance and maximizing soil cover protect soil organism habitat. Looks like everybody's getting that right. Awesome. All right. Any brief questions before we go on to talking about barriers to adoption? Well, if there are no questions, I will go on to talk a little bit more about the barriers to soil health adoption. We've had a number of speakers speak to this a little bit. We're going to get into it a lot more for the economic piece of it, but I wanted to kind of frame it, adoption categories. We can look at this adoption curve and basically think about how for soil health right now, mostly we have innovators and early adopters, right? And it used to be that there were just innovators. Certainly 20 years ago when I was getting into the soil health space, there were a few innovators out there who had just gotten started, and there were a few innovators that had been in it for 20, 30, 40 years. But it was far and few in between, and hardly anybody was talking about soil health. And now we've actually got quite a few early adopters of soil health. So we're probably getting into the, 5 to 10% or so of adoption of some of these systems in some places, but not everywhere. Cover crops in general, we're still in the single digits, maybe 4 or 5%, 6%, depending on where you go, sometimes less than that. Sometimes in a few places, there's a lot more than that. What we're trying to do, what I would love to see happen in the next 5 to 10 years is to get into that early and late majority of adopters, right? We want to make this commonplace. We want to make this kind of agriculture the new norm. And there are a number of hurdles to getting to that. And so I'm just going to frame these. You saw this from Marlon earlier, right? There's all these stages of adoption, and we're trying to get farmers all the way from getting them aware that this even exists, all the way through to where they're successfully adopting. And one of the tricks with that is that sometimes when somebody tries something out, they don't right away get good results. And some of them say, okay, I've been there, done that, never touching that again, that failed, right? That's what we really want to avoid. And so we need to be a bit caveated when we talk to producers first about soil health and adoption. And we need to support them as they try it out and provide them with enough technical assistance or enough connections where they can get some of that support so that they know that, yeah, sometimes something fails on first try because it's a learning curve. It needs a big paradigm shift, right? And that's one of the key things that Marlon talked about also. It's not just about the understanding of the physical system and what needs to be done. There's also a social and economic hurdle to overcome because not everybody is doing this, right? And to be an outlier, to be somebody who's doing things differently from everybody else, that's very comfortable for some people, but it's really not for most people. Most people prefer to have at least a few friends that they're doing something with so that they're not completely on their own, right? And so how do we build the kinds of networks that are supportive of that adoption is one of the things that we need to really talk about there. Awareness and understanding isn't just about the logical understanding, right? There's a huge human component and there's a huge economic component. And so I want you to kind of think in the back of your heads about how do you currently perceive it in your area, right? What is the current perception of soil health in your region? And what is it that's keeping people in your area from implementing these practices? If you know, we'd love to know whether you even know that about your region or not. And that can be the first step as you're getting into the space of how do we help people adopt these practices, one thing to start with is to say, okay, well, where are you at with that right now? Are there challenges that you foresee? Are there reasons you're not doing it? And really kind of understanding where every producer is coming from, so that we can meet them where they're at and help them through that transition. So some common barriers to soil health adoption. They're kind of in a big framework. We can think about them as social and psychological barriers, technical barriers, and financial barriers. Those are kind of the main three categories. The social and psychological barriers, that's the big paradigm shift that has to happen, right? If my dad did it that way, my grandpa did it that way, my great-grandpa did it that way, why should I do it any differently? It's working, right? When that's where somebody is at, it's pretty difficult to get from that space all the way to, here's this new way that we can now think about soils. Look, you're a livestock owner, even though you thought you were a cotton grower. Actually, you have billions of livestock and they're what make everything work, right? I mean, that's a pretty big shift. But I've seen producers make that shift, and especially people like Marlon who are out there every day talking with producers who are in the process of making that shift. They see that shift happen and they're learning to facilitate that. So if you've got producers that might be interested, ideally we find them somebody who's a support network, you know, who can provide some guidance along the way. Recovery from failures, like I referred to, that can be pretty tricky. A lot of farmers are risk averse, and for good reason. This is their livelihood, right? They need to actually come up with enough money to feed their family, and so just willy-nilly trying something that sounds totally crazy is a scary prospect, right? So we have to be able to support them enough, and that's really where I think a lot of the technical and financial assistance that's offered by NRCS and some other agencies can really make a big difference. Lack of community support, right? I mean, for a lot of farmers, coffee shop talk is really important. And if in your coffee shop, it's about the clean-tilled field, it can be really difficult to be different. And so that's where some folks were saying, yeah, you know, some people start on their back 40 where nobody can see it, so they can confirm to themselves that it actually makes sense. And then something that I think a lot of you may be encountering, possibly, I'd love to hear whether you are, is landlord-tenant relationships. All of you work with landowners. Are your landowners also the farmers, or are they landowners who aren't operating on their own land, but they've got somebody renting their land and managing it? And so the adoption there can be really tricky, because suddenly there's two people that have to be involved or more in the decision to transition to these practices. And sometimes on one end or the other, there's not the support that needs to be there. When it comes to technical hurdles, right, we've been talking about a number of them, whether it's the hurdles of the weather, the soil type, the production system, the markets. How do you exactly do that, right? Which cover crop? When do you plant it? How do you plant it? What rate do you plant it at? When do you terminate it? There are so many nuances to this, and a producer has to deal with so many different things. They can't suddenly turn into an expert on cover cropping. And so that's a tricky hurdle, right? For any of these practices, there has to first be a baseline understanding before they can start doing something very different. Financial, there are definitely hurdles, for example, with equipment. We talked about some of those, right? And then lack of information on economic costs and benefits is a really big one. And that's a space that American Farmland Trust has been working a lot in. And you all are lucky you're going to get to hear from Michelle and the team about the soil health economic calculator work that we've been doing in the case studies. Markets can also be really tricky, right? If you're trying to suddenly diversify your crops, you're going from corn, soybean, and now you're also growing livestock, or now you're also going to start growing fruit trees. That's a whole different system. So where do you sell those products, right? So figuring out those markets can be a really big barrier to changing to a new system, in addition to, well, how do you even technically do that when you've never done that before? And then there are impacts of policies, right? Who has access to EQIP? Who has access to CSB or various other financial assistance kinds of instruments? A lot of the time, the really large growers see the benefit really well, but when you've got a per acre payment and somebody has 5 acres, well, that doesn't really amount to much, and often isn't worth the time to go through all the paperwork until you get your $100 worth of $20 per acre for that particular practice, right? And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that policy space of how do we create access to technical and financial assistance for small scale, beginning, underserved kinds of producers who are working in different systems than those who have generally gotten that financial assistance. So definitely a tricky space. So those are some of the barriers. And there's a number of solutions out there, and that's exciting, right? There's a lot of people thinking really long and hard about this, trying out different things. And some of the things that are working out there is just building relationships. Producers change their minds and change their operations mostly through really excellent relationships. When they've got the support from either a peer or a technical service provider or a consultant or an ag retailer that they trust, that's where some of those changes are made. So building the kinds of relationships, building the kinds of networks, cohorts, peer-to-peer networks, mentoring networks that help producers have the community to go to when they run into issues, where they can source ideas, where they can go see somebody's farm that's similar enough to theirs to see that it actually works. That can be a really big help. And developing financial assistance networks, helping farmers get access to all the different resources that are out there, providing farmers access to training so that they can transition successfully, connecting producers to all the various resources that are out there. These are some of the solutions, and we could talk about those for a long time, but I will move on. It can be pretty tricky to move all the way from awareness to adoption. And so working in all these spaces, building the relationships, building opportunities for education, inviting and accompanying farmers to soil health related events and then having conversations with them about it, putting on those events. We've had a number of the participants in these workshops go through their soil health action plan and then start to actually put on soil health events and bring producers that they work with and others to those events, and having a lot of success getting people pretty excited about it. So it's great to see that kind of momentum building up. Really excitingly, I talked a bit about the partnerships for climate smart commodities. We've got several of them that we're involved in, and a lot of these projects, $3 billion worth of projects, are focusing on addressing some of these barriers, markets for these practices and access for underserved producers. We've got two major projects that we are leading in, and both of them really, one based on beef, one more in commodity crops. Both of them tackle this area of providing a trusted technical and financial assistance network. In our beef project, we're actually building a grazing mentors network of innovative mentors who will be mentoring new transitioning producers so that they can transition to climate smart practices for beef. And similarly for a larger national level project with Truterra, again, there through advanced soil health training, we're going to build up an influencer network that will work through their networks with a number of producers to help them adopt practices. And so really working in that space of building peer-to-peer networks and building networks where there are advisors and innovators and folks who have a lot of experience in the space who are available to new beginners who are interested but just don't really know how to go about it. So, couple of things to remember, right? Soil degradation doesn't happen overnight. We've been creating the kind of very degraded soils that we have for a long time. And so adopting soil health management is a long-term investment, and we can't expect it to immediately take hold. Now, some of the folks in my division used to say, well, Bianca, you know, actually, you can see some really major impact in about 2 years. And I believe it. There are definitely farmers who can make really major impact really fast. I just don't want folks to expect that, because in some systems it takes a long time, but it can be fast, right? So let's all hop to it, right? Ideally, let's get everybody started, and hopefully we'll get everybody transitioned to these new systems. Lots of benefits in store. If this poll is in the system and if we have time for it, we can take it. I just kind of wanted to poll the audience to see what you know about barriers that your landowners are encountering. Is there one particularly that stands out to you? thank you, everybody. Would be really interested in hearing everybody's thoughts, so feel free to engage in the chat throughout coming sessions, and we'll monitor that and get some answers to you if you are thinking about the space as you go about the workshop.